This is Inspiring Design, where unique innovators come together to share their knowledge, share their insight, and keep us up to date with the latest industry trends. And here's your host, Rashan Senanayake.
What's up, listeners? We are live with episode 16 of Inspiring Design with yours truly, Rashan. Today is all about urban design, and I have here with me one of the best industry experts from RPS, Peter Egerton. Peter has been part of the urban design and planning profession for the last 31 years. He's the current lead urban designer for RPS. Peter is based in Brisbane, but has a wide perspective from leading projects from Sydney to Port Douglas to New Zealand and in Western Australia. His focus is integrating design and planning expertise with sustainable development practices to create successful urban spaces for living, working, and visiting. Impressive indeed, and thank you so much, Peter, for giving up your time.
No problems, Rashan. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Can we start by understanding a little bit of background and experience of yourself?
Sure thing. I grew up in Hervey Bay in North Queensland, so quite near Fraser Island.
So you haven't always been in Brisbane?
Haven't always been in Brisbane. No, that was my early years of schooling, was in a small country town, effectively at the time. And then moved to Brisbane for secondary school, and then went to university at the University of Queensland and studied town planning. Finished that in 1988, and then worked on the Gold Coast for a number of years before returning back to Brisbane and really starting from scratch with then Pike Mills McNulty was the name of the company prior to RPS.
Wow, right. I see. So that's actually, I've visited your office multiple times, but I've never known that. There you go.
Yeah, quite a few name changes along the way, but we might cover that off as we go through some project backgrounds. But you do draw on your background in terms of when I'm doing smaller country towns and smaller things. You rely on that. First, the Gold Coast, which was the Ritz and the Glitz of the 80s on the Gold Coast. My first job was the Mirage resorts on the Gold Coast, and I thought all jobs were like that with the Scases. No, that was quite an unusual period, but a really good learning phase.
Yeah. Well, today's about urban design. We've been covering off different design disciplines in each episode, and this one's actually something that I'm really excited about because I feel like it's almost a big brother of architecture. And I'm not sure. That's why I want to learn and clarify the lines for a lot of the listeners as well. In your experience, how do you define what is urban design?
It's a really tricky and difficult area to explain, and yet it's quite an easy area to work in, to practice in, because of the ability, the fluid nature of the description and what you can be involved in. The easiest way I can describe it is it's really sits in between the three core disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, and town planning. And I position urban design in the middle of those three.
Yeah.
Within that, you can be more of an architectural-based urban designer, and most architects do and can call themselves urban designers because effectively that's what they're doing. And I'll
just at a bigger scale.
It's getting them to often think beyond the brief of the particular building, to think outside the boundaries. Now, some are better at it than others. Mm-hmm. Some are, go wildly crazy outside the boundaries and actually have to pull them back in a little bit.
Yeah.
So that's architecture, and I think architects would think that architecture is the big brother of urban design. Then the architecture bubble can drift closer to landscape architecture. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit more like streetscape type public realm applications. Yep. You really need to know a little bit more about the detail of landscape architecture to be into that space, or you can drift towards town planning, which is more the master planning of new communities or new suburbs or infill, and that's more about the approval mechanism and how do you get it delivered. So a really clever urban designer can bounce between all three, and if you're really, really clever, you surround yourself with people who have a range of those disciplines, and then you can constantly tap into them. So in our organisation, a third come from an architecture training background, a third from landscape architecture, and a third from town planning.
Wow.
And that's the preferred mix.
Yeah.
Because you can see it in the way people operate. There's a slightly different approach to particular problems.
So that basically means you will need to be able to jump between those specialities almost if you're an urban designer. I feel like, is that correct?
Yeah, there's a bit of that, and there's also a bit of knowing when to stop as well.
Yeah.
Like when am I outside of my discipline and I need to speak to my landscape architecture colleagues and let them take carriage of this, or when am I into the built form? When we do built form, we call it massing. To us, all the buildings are
just blocks.
White in colour and like blocks. That's what we're trying to do. Or maybe the streetscape might have some colour in it, and above that, we don't really have an opinion. And even when we do our drawings, we draw our buildings really bland because that's not our contribution. That we leave that to the architect. So we're trying to, leave where you leave a vacuum, people will fill it with good ideas.
Yeah.
So you're trying to leave that little vacuum on things.
Yeah.
And then town planning, it's I'm not going to be able to spell out all the approval mechanisms and every part of the town planning process. I have a broad knowledge of it, but I rely on my colleagues to fill in the gaps. Outside of that core ring that you're bouncing around as an urban designer, there's engineering, traffic engineering, hydrology, stormwater management, ecology, all of those other disciplines. You're drawing on all of those as well. So you have to have a knowledge of who does what, when is it appropriate, and how do I utilise their skill set. So often we're sort of sitting in the middle of all of that.
Wow, that's a seriously impressive place to be in, I feel like.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun. But you got to trust people. You got to trust people in their discipline and know when to sort of kick in and when to kick out, when to let people do their thing, and when to sort of give an opinion and push. And sometimes you drift into other people's space. So, I love locking horns with traffic engineers. Because the way they do things, they shovel a bunch of numbers in a little black box, shake it around and pull out an answer. And I always wanted to get in that black box and go, how did you do that? Like, how did you get to that?
Shake a magic 8-ball.
Pretty much. But then also trust that, if they stick to their guns and say that my professional opinion is this, that you've got to respect that, even if you don't necessarily understand how they get to that.
Yeah. No, I love it. I think, and one of the questions that I get asked all the time from our listeners is, how do you enter and what's the process of becoming that particular designer? For example, how do you become an architect or a landscape architect or interior designer? So in this case, how does one become an urban designer? Is there an arduous qualification and registration process like, say, in architecture or landscape, or is it a bit more flexible?
It's very flexible. And in a way that drives the architecture, landscape architecture, town planning disciplines nuts, because they are quite, all three of those in their different ways have their structures and their organisation, and they are trying to protect their field. But urban designers tend to sort of float in, float out. I understand their annoyance, but it is what it is. You are pulling from all those disciplines. So I am a member of PEER, the Planning Institute, because my training and my background is a town planning degree.
Yeah.
But I probably work closer with landscape architecture and architecture than I do town planning. So it's an interesting mix. How do you get into it? It's urban design is a relatively new field. I think if you went back 40 years, the term probably didn't exist. It might have in a couple of uses, and it's certainly in America, they used to call it town founding.
Oh, wow, okay.
For example.
This is all new information to me.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting background how it all came together. I personally got into it. My father was a land surveyor, so
I see.
In their day, the surveyor did everything. So the surveyor was the town planner. They were the surveyor. Sometimes even the engineer in New South Wales and in New Zealand. And if they had been a member of a local authority for over 5 years, they automatically were given a town planning and an urban design qualification. That's actually how it used to work in local government in Queensland.
Yeah.
So I saw my father doing designs, of subdivisions and layouts, and even as a kid, I thought I could fix that for you.
How old were you then?
12 or so.
Wow, there you go. I think you're meant to be in this industry.
Yeah, it's more the maths was dominating, which is
see.
the way surveyors historically laid things out. That's why our cities are in grids.
Yeah.
Because the chain's 20 metres wide, and that's why all streets are 20 metres wide. It's a mathematical measurement. It was easy for them to do, and straight lines up and over hills are easy to lay out if you're in the hot sun whacking pegs in the ground.
Yeah.
But whereas, now there's a little bit more to it, there's a little bit more to understand. So when I say fix it, I'm being cheeky. It's like to absorb a lot more information and pop out a slightly different answer than, 0 degree bearings and, even measurements.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit on the background of urban design. So effectively, anybody that already has a discipline in architecture, landscape architecture, or town planning can really call themselves an urban designer. But if you don't have training, background or knowledge or interest, or have studied broader into that area, then you really are going to struggle, because you're going to keep following your trained discipline rather than an understood and a learned discipline, which is what urban design is. Yeah,
look, that completely makes sense. And being in the middle of all those things, it's quite hard to, I think, control that process to allow that fluid movement. Is there a registration process or a chartered level, say, compared to the Board of Architects that govern urban design?
Not at all. So there really is nothing. The organisation of urban designers has tried over the years. I think UDEL was the last version of that. And
UDEL stands for?
The Urban Design Alliance, I think, is what it is. And that was really all urban designers coming together, trying to say, hey, we're all urban designers coming together. We value this. We put a badge on it to say that we're qualified in our areas, but they can never sort of take the next step and go, and what is that qualification?
Yeah.
You can now study urban design at most design-based universities. So, they'll cover, you'll start in landscape architecture or town planning, and you can do urban design as a stand-up degree now. And then you can also do further education in urban design.
Yeah.
Most of the lecturers, again, would come from another discipline's background, but may call themselves urban designers.
Yeah.
But they equally won't have a qualification as such in urban design. They might have a Masters of Urban Design, but that was normally done through a town planning course, and it was exactly the same as the town planning course. It was just called the Masters of Urban Design, because you picked up a couple of different subjects.
Yeah.
So it's because it's so new, it's really still finding its feet as a discipline, like lots of other new disciplines that are out there.
Definitely. I think even through speaking to designers such as yourself in different industries, I've found that there are now design disciplines that didn't exist 5 to 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
So it's splitting off and becoming a central point for a lot of industries, and it's a really cool time, I think. And it makes sense maybe in 5 to 10 years' time, once that tertiary qualification that's starting to come into play will maybe be required down the track. Who knows? But one of the questions that's been burning in my mind is, you mentioned that people in town planning, having studied that, can then become an urban designer. So what exactly is the difference between an urban designer and a town planner?
So, jokingly, a number of urban designer master planners who have been operating in Australia, we often say that town planners stole our name.
I see, right.
Because we're actually planning the towns.
Wow.
they're doing statutory planning.
Yep.
I say that very tongue in cheek because town planning's quite a it's not a hugely old discipline. In fact, RPS, the company I work for, stands for the Rural Planning Service of the UK. RPS, Rural Planning Service of the UK. So it started with an individual town planner who, in the UK, they've got very contained urban environments, but no one was looking outside of the urban area in the rural. So he started doing town planning applications for farms and rural activities, and that's where RPS came from. So town planning is quite a new field as well. It's only probably about 10 years ahead of urban design, effectively. So it's got a little bit more structure. The nature of town planning and the nature of getting approvals and almost the litigious nature of town planning now means that it has to be a bit more formalised. They try and have CPD training for town planners. They have trouble following through on it because most people like the idea of it and then don't necessarily always do it. So they're struggling themselves to keep that discipline of a field themselves. And then urban design comes along and starts pinching out bits of what they think they do as well.
Yeah.
But I always try and, with all the town planners that I work with in my work, I know that there's an urban designer in there somewhere because they did study it at university, albeit very briefly nowadays. I think I was very fortunate in the late 80s that we were next to the architecture faculty at Queensland Uni, so we got to do shared lectures for the first 2 years at uni, which is where I sparked my interest. And I'm more interested in that over there than that over there. And then it kind of separated and it went to geosciences, went to GIS rather than architecture. So town planning sort of moved as a faculty into another area. And then we could see it in the nature of the students that came out as graduates. They didn't even know what a contour was. So, we basically train our urban designers from scratch, even when they come out of an urban design degree.
Yeah. Well, I think by the sounds of it, it feels like urban design is the naughty sibling of town planning who's been around for a while, and I feel like is evolving and changing the way things have been done. How long has urban design been around as a label?
That's a great question. I would think it has been around for a while because it's really a term that architecture would have used, describing like a city block versus a site within a block. I think that
macro context.
Yeah, that would if you're trying to describe that macro area, you'd naturally start talking about, I'm not really doing a building, and I'm not really doing a park. So what I'm doing the urban bit. So I must be doing urban design.
Yeah.
So that's a reasonably logical process to follow. So I imagine outside of the discipline, the term was used quite a lot as almost like a flavour of the month term to try and separate yourself from other people.
Yeah.
So master planning did the same thing, but master planning never held. So what's the difference between a site architect and a master planner? Not a lot.
Yeah.
Depending on what they're doing.
Because a lot of the architectural firms conduct master planning skills, and I'm actually thinking through what happens in the architectural degree when we're even teaching first years. Their site currently, the project that in the classroom that I had this morning, it's all the way through William Jolly Bridge and Queen Street and all these public forums. It's not a contained site. So they're actually considering the broader context of movement, the uses of the external buildings, and they're not designing a building. They're designing an installation that fits into that context. And I like the fact that it's now becoming spatial exploration, not a building.
So that's urban design.
There you go.
You just described urban design. That's exactly what it is. You're within the urban context, you're trying to facilitate an outcome. Now that might be a building, but might not be. It might be a bus stop, or it might be a tree, or a shade area, or a shelter, or something like that. And you're trying to position where that is and how does it fit in that context. So that's why it's quite natural to drift out of architecture and start talking about. But an architect being pure about what the discipline is, often feel an an onus to call it architecture, even though it's probably urban design.
Yeah.
Because they're worried about drifting into the landscape architect space.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they require the landscape architect. So we have landscape architectures in our organisation, and it's always an interesting tap dance. How far do I go with this before I have to hand it over to my colleagues, and then they're doing it in reverse back to you, going, I'm doing something. I've probably drifted into the space of the street around my area. Do I really need to talk to an urban designer? I'll say, no, you have that training. You're quite within your capabilities to do that. So we literally bounce like a pinball, bouncing between architecture, landscape architecture and town planning.
Yeah.
And depends, is it more urban design or is it master planning?
Yeah.
So we do a lot of large developments, 1,000 hectare master plan community. That's master planning.
Yeah.
But it's still actually called urban design in our brief.
Yeah.
But
see, it makes sense, and I think it's a similar battle between architects and interior designers, because
a little bit, yeah.
They're doing the building. We would technically design the spaces as well, but then where do you draw the line where an interior designer needs to go through? And I feel like that pinball analogy works really well, because I've seen that happen. I've been a part of that process, and I feel like this is a difference in scale, but we're all kind of headed towards the same outcome of spatial exploration, designing for an end user. It's the built environment, all falls under those tabs, and bringing the environment in, all of those things that we design. So it's actually really interesting. So looking at what an urban designer is, and now I'm getting a clear picture of what an urban design is capable of and is required to do. In your opinion, what are the hard skills and soft skills that we need to have under the belt? Because I do have a lot of students that listen to this, and teachers who want to guide their students in the right pathway, and even for their own interests. What are the skills that they need to look out for and start to develop if they're thinking, one day I want to become an urban designer?
I think you start in your core area. So let's say you start as a landscape architect, and you study that core area. Then you try and look for, when I'm doing a broader area, let's say it's a square, a civic space. You'll then start to say, okay, I clearly need to have a civil engineer here because I've got pipes and services and things under the road. But I'm actually going to touch the buildings on an edge, so I really need to either have a little bit of a mind's eye to landscape architecture, height, building, awnings, or I go and source an architect to do that with me. I can deal with, now as the landscape architect, I can deal with spatially the ground plane, the height, what's over my head. Now I need to work out how I'm going to get this thing approved. I actually need to drift into town planning now.
So it's almost dependent on where your interest lies.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I always go, you need kind of like a core interest to start with, and then you can grow. That's your
foundation, your passion.
Yeah. You do come back to your core interests. I certainly go back to the process that I learned in doing town planning. You rely on that it's a very structured process, which is not dissimilar to what architecture does and not dissimilar to what landscape architecture does, but you have your own sort of form of it. It might be top down, whereas the landscape architect might be bottom up in terms of how they do it. And you do see the different people with their different disciplines and how they approach it. You get to the same place. You just come at it from a slightly different angle.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. And in terms of hands-on skills, like what does an average day as an urban designer look like? Like, do you employ still hand sketching? Do you pull out the yellow trace, or do you work on, let's say, one of the CAD softwares or design softwares? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, all of the above. Really.
I see.
We have just recently put all of our staff back through a design thinking drawing course.
Awesome.
Because we felt like they were losing their hand-drawn skills a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
There's some wonderful things in technology that we'll talk about in a little while. But, resolving an issue with somebody where you grab a napkin and you grab a pen and you go, do you mean this? And they look at it and go, yep, that's what I mean. I couldn't articulate it. I couldn't draw it for you. I just explained it to you, and we draw it and go, do you mean that? and it's very powerful when you do that. And also, I do most of my drawing now outside of the office, in other people's offices on their desks or outside or whatever. I use my hand-drawn skills quite a lot. My skills aren't at the level they were probably at when I first started, because we spent days and days and days drawing master plans. So I can draw a golf course without a scale ruler now.
Wow, that's impressive.
Designed way too many golf courses for my own good back in the 80s on the Gold Coast. In that little boom. I've sort of memorised the whole thing, and I hate golf. I can't play it. I have nothing to do with it. But
we were actually talking with David, our David Thompson, when we spoke about landscape architecture, exactly about golf course designs and what that falls into from a landscape point of view. So it's interesting that it comes up again, and that's quite impressive, because I don't think that university students coming out in this decade can say that.
No, that's right. That was a learn on the job with sitting next to golf course architects at times and watch how they did it. Ask them a gazillion annoying questions and then start doing it yourself. Like, you're not going to ever resolve the layout of the golf course. There is a speciality there, and they're really good at it. The golf course designers, there's a little bit of science to what they do. Mm-hmm. We try and work out, can we fit that in that 70 hectares? That's what we're and can we get the housing around it? Can we get the stormwater through it? And where does the clubhouse sit? The rest of it goes, back to the golf course designer. It's a bit interactive, that whole process, because I was involved in the Brookwater, early designs of Brookwater, with the medalist group, Greg Norman, and they are 100% about the golf course. And as soon as they cross that golf course boundary, they really don't understand or care what happens beyond it. But as the urban designer, we wanted to know, is that open space? Is that a road? Is that the back of somebody's house? And how far away from the pin is it? Because there's measurements of how far balls fly from those spaces. And Brookwater is about selling a lot of residential land that happens to have a golf course, whereas the golf course designers, it's all about the golf course, and there's some other stuff that's around it. A different approach again.
I see, and it's quite interesting, and I think we mentioned briefly before about putting design thinking and how that process comes into play. This is obviously a common factor, and I think a terminology that's been thrown around. Even it's coming into the other industries, but obviously design thinking has the word design in it. So there's a lot of assumptions about what that means, and depending on the industry, sometimes they have different labels. And design thinking, on its core, human-centric design is one of my specialities, but from a commercial level. I'm not specializing in a very particular design. How does that come into play as an urban designer?
Yeah, there's sort of it's a roller coaster ride with it design thinking. We start with try and verify what we're doing. What are we working on? What's the outcome? What do people want? That sounds really easy, but that's actually one of the hardest things to do at the start, because often people don't know. They have no idea. And
we want to naturally jump into that solution and ideation without understanding.
Absolutely. And if I criticise architecture, often architecture jumps into that way too early. Because they just want to draw and they just want to come up with an outcome.
Exactly.
But it's like, no, maybe go back to the start and go, what are they really trying? What do they really want to do here? So you sort of test them a little bit and test, do you really know what your site is? Do you really own that over there? So there's that information gathering is a big part at the start. And the more accurate you get with your information gathering, the better the result. So people will say to me, even if I'm reviewing an existing design and they want your opinion on it, they'll say, look, I won't show you the previous master plan and I won't show you the information that has already been gathered on this. And I'll go, well, why not? Show it to me. I can distill out what I want to take out of it or not, but not showing me something is a bit silly because you've already paid for that.
Of course.
So why not take the benefit? It's not going to skew what I'm going to think about because I'm going to follow my process and come up with my outcome anyway, if that's what you want me to do. So there's information gathering, and then there's it all gets a bit much. can get quite unwieldy.
Yeah.
Lots of different opinions.
Yeah.
Lots of meetings about where we're going, and you might have strong personalities that stormwater's overriding roading or something in terms of what's going on, and then you start to problem solve, and that's when design thinking is there. And we certainly still find design thinking is best done hand drawn. Mm-hmm. It's quicker. Mm-hmm. I can do 10 options hand drawn that takes somebody time to do one option properly on a computer. So design thinking is about no idea is a bad idea. I did the early structure planning work on North Lakes, north of Brisbane, which is a 1,000-hectare development with a Scottish urban designer. Mm-hmm. So Lawson McCowan, he would have been in his 60s when we started doing North Lakes, and he'd been an urban designer for most of his life.
Wow.
So 40 or 45 years of urban design.
There you go.
And Lawson was a demon for there's one more way at this, there's one more go at this. So we could spend a whole day in a room designing a particular precinct or something, and just when you think you've got it sorted, Lawson would always try and get one more out.
Now, this is something that I actually encourage with my students, whether they're teachers or at a tertiary level. We focus on quantity because we feel like we need to exhaust options, even if their technology or the budget constraints or site constraints aren't there. We actually don't limit that at that point. Is that how it's done in this context?
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. And we still use butter paper. And if you really don't like the design, you'll screw the butter paper up, and you'll probably go back to it about 10 minutes later and flatten out the butter paper and go, it wasn't such a bad idea.
See, I feel like that's what my students are gonna get a sigh of relief from that, hearing that, because they do that, and sometimes they think doing trace paper is not what's done in the industry.
Oh no, it's very, very common for us now. We insisted that all of our urban designers were in a brand new building here, designed by a fairly well-known architect in Brisbane, and they couldn't believe that we still use drawing boards, and we have a drawing board for every urban designer in this office.
I love it.
And they are on butter paper. We're doing master plan communities, so we've got quite large pieces of paper. AO is normal for us. And when I brought the architects in, they were gobsmacked and actually honestly dismissed it for the first 3 versions of the plan and said, look, you may be asking for drawing boards, but we're telling you don't use them anymore.
Wow.
And we kept pointing out that we were actually the client and that they really should start listening to what we're asking. But I went to their office and I said, have you got any drawing boards in this office of 120 people? And they had one A3 size drawing board. So clearly they didn't do any hand drawing.
Yeah.
So they were all automated.
Yeah.
And maybe you could see it in their design because they couldn't problem solve how to fit a drawing board in a layout, and they're an architect.
I definitely think so, because given I've come from that technology era, I still believe the technology hasn't quite caught up to replacing a hand drawing. And we were talking with one of the senior lecturers from QUT exactly on hand sketching skills, and he's of the same belief that regardless of how much technology will develop, I feel like there's always going to be that human touch that's almost irreplaceable.
Yeah, no, I agree. When you're distilling an enormous amount of information, and often that is, what you're dealing with, you've got a blank page, you've got a whole layer of information sitting under that page of contours or services or something. You've got all the balance in your head of what you've read and what you've been talking about, and you've got a pen, and you have to resolve it on that piece of paper.
Yeah.
So it's very confronting. Whereas if you're doing it on the computer, it's accurate. You're worried about the measurement. Is that 20 metres long or is that 21 metres long? When you've got the pen, you just draw it.
Yeah.
And you go back and measure it later.
Yeah.
And we have a saying in here, the bigger the problem, the thicker the pen.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So if you can't solve the problem, get a chunkier pen and bring it up a level. So try and stand back from it and resolve it. Bigger, don't get into the detail too soon, because if you drop into the detail, you're going to miss some really obvious things at the start. So I cheekily used to do that in my interviews with people. I'd put a pencil, a normal pen, and a thick pen in front of them and see which one they'd choose. And if they chose the pencil, they wouldn't get the job.
Wow, there you go. I think that's valuable advice. Like if you're a student struggling with I think if you're a designer, I think we would all come across problems that we would be stuck for ideas. And then I think that's a valuable piece of advice. Such a simple medium switch, but an effective technique. And I think for teachers listening, for students listening, whether it's their own project or if they're doing a classroom activity, I think that's perfect. Amazing.
Yeah, no, and there's some really... I was fortunate enough to work with Desmond Brooks, who is an architect on the Gold Coast, Media 5, which is DBI design.
Yep.
And Desmond, he had a multidisciplinary group, so architecture, interior, graphics, town planning, and landscape architecture. That was the 5. And if we were doing a master plan, and South Bank is a great example. So we were doing the competition design for South Bank, and Desmond couldn't understand when we were forming the team why there was just town planners and architects involved and landscape architecture, and why we didn't have the graphics and the interior design people on the team. So he insisted, and he said, well, look, they think through a design process as well. So you're trying to create lots of little rooms in this park, so wouldn't you have an interior designer on your team? And so it did, and they were wonderful. They did the yoga, yoga area, the meditation area of South Bank. That was actually designed by an interior designer.
Wow. In
the original competition, quite a well-known one on the Gold Coast. So that design process that you follow, all of those disciplines actually still follow that process. So, and when you're sitting on a drawing board with somebody from that discipline, you learn a lot when you design or draw with them. So I was really fortunate that I got to learn that way on the tools with people and learn their tricks. If you get stuck on something, like every page norths up, and we know where the sun rises, we know where the sun sets, and we know where things drain. But if you're stuck on the design, turn the page upside down or inside out, walk away from it, come back to it and try again. And often you'll crack it, because you've just changed the whole circumstance.
I feel like my students need to be here, because the number of times I've told them that north is up and they argue with me on that.
North is always up. Always up.
There you go. You heard it here first, actually, for probably the 20th time. I repeat it over and over again in my classrooms.
Yeah, except if you're in the Northern Hemisphere.
True.
But solving that design problem, sometimes you've got to turn it back to front and inside out. You've got to go back to north up and check it at the end of it. But it's just a way of tricking your brain to go, oh, this is a new problem to solve. I was stuck on that old problem. I'll work it out on this one. And it's a trick that I was taught back in the day by interior designers, and it really works.
Yeah, definitely. I think sometimes you actually letting your subconscious work on the same problem. I think the number of times I've come up with working solutions in the middle of the night and I've been sleeping, and at first, I think I've made the rookie mistake of not writing it down and assuming that I will remember it in the morning. Doesn't work.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's exactly that. Giving yourself a break so you can see that problem with a fresh pair of eyes. Yeah, that works. That's valuable advice. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the values of design thinking. The main 3 is empathy, collaboration, and experimentation. And I understand how collaboration and experimentation comes into this as an urban designer. That's pivotal, being in the center point. When it comes to empathy, can you clarify how that process takes place at that early research part before you start to problem solve? Do you actually spend time thinking about who the end user of that space might be, and how detailed do you go into with empathizing with that end user?
Oh, significant. That's a really big part of what you do, and every circumstance is different, and you actually have to tailor your empathy to that circumstance. So how do I explain that? So if I'm master planning an estate, like a new expansion area in northern New South Wales, say, for an example, you really need to understand what's the dynamic behind the people there. Affordability is actually a massive issue currently in the northern part of New South Wales. Even though it's a beautiful place and everyone wants to be there, there's some really poor outcomes occurring because of the lack of affordability. So you've got to get into that space with them and go, we're not trying to design here for the affluent or for expensive lots. We're actually trying to diminish the cost of construction and diminish the outcome. We still want to get a good result, but we don't want to overshoot because we're trying to accommodate those people who can't find somewhere to live, not those people who already have somewhere to live. So you have to drop into that space as quickly as you can, because it really flavours what you do and how you prosecute your other disciplines and alike. Whereas if you're doing a part of town, let's say a riverside park area, it's a bit broader, isn't it? You're really trying to cover a broader part of the population. You're trying to account for everybody in every circumstance. So wheelchairs, kids on little bikes, or young kids or elderly. You're trying to understand who it is you're designing for and how you're going to accommodate all those people. So yeah, that's a really big part of that early information gathering of positioning where you are. We'll often do it when we're doing urban regeneration or infill or even master plan communities. We'll actually put up pictures of who we think is the target market and wait till somebody tells us otherwise, and we just keep putting it up and putting it up and putting it up.
Perfect, because that was actually one of the questions I was going to ask you, whether obviously the term in commercial sense is the persona cards of and the stakeholder personas actually, of what that target audience might look like, giving it a face, understanding their demographics, what they would say, do, feel, think, and understanding at that core level, giving them a face, so it actually, as a designer, you develop a relationship with that person, hypothetically.
Yeah.
But I'm so happy to hear that it happens at this level as well. So when you're thinking about a very broad level, using that example you mentioned, well, how many persona cards might you have? You might have a couple of hundred. Is that
absolutely? Yeah,
wow.
Absolutely, yeah. And you're always learning. Like I'm involved in a fairly large master plan community in Western Sydney, and it's for a large public company, and they were following their standard process and their standard model and their standard lot sizing and their standard price pointing and the like. And they started to get market feedback, and they realised that they had misread the market. They're getting more information in as they go, so they're getting wiser as the project goes along. And it had an extremely high percentage of Indian buyers, like a massive percentage. And they hadn't really cottoned on to what those buyers would like. So, in the start of the process, once they realised what was going on, they did a bit of research. And for us, as designers, we were having trouble tapping into that research, but the sales ladies who were working there were Indian. So we said, can we get the sales ladies to come into our design session?
Yeah.
And they were wonderful because, often you're not meant to have the designers with the salespeople, which is rubbish. It's worked very effectively for me historically because, they'll call a spade a shovel. Pretty early on, if they want it, because they're the ones who are tasked with selling it at the end. So why wouldn't you ask them what they think will help them do that job early on? And they were fantastic, and it turned the design on its head because they had to explain to us that north and east weren't the desired aspects, and in fact it was west and south, and explain to us why. And were very compelling in their explanation, and also a lot more dual occupancy living. So the number of bedrooms had increased because there were shared families, and they articulated it beautifully for us, and it reset the whole project, and we were able to change the layout so it suited the people who wanted to live there, which is such a basic thing.
Of course, yeah.
But if you looked at it from the outside, you'd go, what are you people doing? Like, why are you turning all these known metrics on their head?
Yeah.
Well, because the people who wanted to live there had a particular outcome that they were seeking. And they had other nuances, other things as well that we were able to work in terms of open space and roading and a few other bits and pieces. But so it's a whole. You've got to take the whole. Just don't take the sales part. Of course. Say thank you very much, salespeople. Now we're going to deal with the public realm.
Yeah.
That's a classic example. That's something that I hadn't really experienced since back in the day of Feng Shui on the Gold Coast in the late 80s, early 90s, where all our blocks were triangular so that the wealth would run into the blocks, not out of the blocks.
Yep.
Stuff like that.
There you go. And honestly, as a designer, I think it adds more value to the end user, and it makes you more aware of cultural things, religious things, social things, community things, and I feel like they're all aspects that a designer needs to consider. So that's perfect.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about how this technology change that's happening at the moment. We're almost in the middle of that shift at the moment with all those sketching skills and the way they're taught at tertiary level. There's almost a generational gap when it comes to the technology evolve, because it's evolving so rapidly. It's impacting almost every single different design discipline in its own way.
Yeah.
How do you see technology such as virtual reality, augmented, artificial intelligence impacting urban design in the current context and even in the 5 to 10, 20 years' time?
Yeah, it is a really interesting area. We confuse our graduates quite a lot because we ask them when we go through the interview process, knowing CAD is a must. All the Adobe packages is a must. Now it's SketchUp as well, and possibly even Lumion now. So we ask all these things, and normally they're very well trained in all of these packages. And then when they start day one, we say, now forget all that. Now you're going to learn how to draw. Because if you can't draw and you can't explain this with your drawing skills,
doesn't matter how good of a renderer you are.
Doesn't matter how good that is.
Yep.
So it's all about the ideas and the design thinking.
Yeah.
So then for 3 years at least, possibly 5, we're retraining them into that skill, how to think in the third dimension.
Yeah.
Really difficult one because, again, people aren't getting trained in it. So understanding the third dimension and being able to, as a designer, being able to regrade and remodel terrain without having an engineer do it in a 2D, 3D program. I can do it on my coffee table at home overnight if I need to. You need to have that skill to be able to think in the third dimension, because when you're in a workshop or you're in a public forum and you're trying to explain it to people and you've only got a limited time, you can't go away in the back room and do it. You have to do it in front of people.
Yeah.
And then they'll understand it. And I don't mind if people watch me draw, I've got no problem. Or hear me mutter to myself, swearing under my breath as I'm struggling with something.
Yeah.
They understand it and they get engaged and they're part of the solution. And, I'll often hand people a pen and go, well, if you know a better way, draw it. I'm not scared for you to grab the pen. It's not a competition on who's the best drawer when you're in workshops. It's about the ideas and getting them down and getting them out of people as effectively as you can while you've got them in a room.
Yeah.
Often we'll say, if we're trying to resolve something, we'll be in a room. We'll say, we're not leaving this room until we've resolved it, because if you've got those discipline and those people in the room, you've got to make the most of it. So live skill is really important at that, and being able to talk and engage people and look at them while you actually draw as well is another good skill, because if you stop looking at them while you're drawing, they'll drift away. So,
wow, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So you can normally do it with about 6 or 8 people around a table. If it gets more than that, you can't get eye contact enough to get the ideas out of them.
Wow. See, I feel like this is a whole new set of skills. It's that needs to be added to the. There's a terminology called 21st century skills that a lot of schools and universities are focusing on. It's making students and the next generation future ready with the jobs that don't even exist now. And obviously, public speaking is one of the key aspects of that. But I feel like this is public sketching.
Yeah, we do a lot of live workshops. We can cram 2 months worth of backwards and forwardsing amongst consultants and clients into 2 days. Wow. So it's a very effective, cost-effective way to do it if you run it properly. But it is about engaging people, and and I certainly know when I do workshops in North Queensland, they're a little bit more reserved. So the groups have got to be 2 and 4, not 6 and 8.
Yeah. Because
if you get 6 or 8 North Queenslanders in a room, no one says anything. So you need to break it down. Whereas Northern New South Wales, everyone wants to talk.
I see.
So you've got to deal with that.
Yeah.
So it is personally. We are designing spaces for people. So you need to be able to interact with people to respond to what they need.
Yeah.
You can't do that sitting behind a computer in the back of an office all the time.
Yeah.
You then need to go and do that afterwards. So
is that where things such as virtual reality and AR come into play as an end tool?
Yeah, they're an end tool. We use some things as a mid tool.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we're struggling, describing things or doing cross sections. It used to be years ago. We tried to describe everything in the third dimension using cross section. So we drew cross section after cross section. But that's a point in time on something that's in a particular location with a particular set of circumstances. And when you're dealing with a large area, I remember doing the cross sections through South Bank.
Wow.
It's a long piece of land. And every 10 metres it was slightly different.
Of course.
So, the virtual mechanisms that you have now would have been a lot better to do that, a lot more cost effective, and got a lot better answer than punching cross sections out all over the place. So, that side of it's a really good tool.
I think it helps add that fourth dimension into someone who's not in a design discipline to experience design in an immersive context.
Yeah. There's I think we're still learning with it. There's going to be some learnings along the ways that often people will jump to that sort of polished end product too early when things aren't resolved as well. Mm-hmm. And you're giving the buying public the opinion or the idea that you've actually resolved. What is that paving type? How high is that gutter? Where is the light pole? And how is that affecting the street tree?
Yeah.
In the virtual world, you just plug it in and it looks great and it works.
And it sets up a false level of expectation.
It's not real because you haven't had you haven't had the electrical contractor say, man, I need 10 metres away from that, not 5 metres, so that tree can't be there.
Yeah.
That's interactive design process is an interactive design process. Just because the tool can put all that together doesn't mean it's resolved.
Yeah.
And that is a lesson that everyone is learning at the moment, because quite a few things have jumped ahead of where they possibly should be. Mm-hmm. And it takes time for the buyer expectation to flow through to say, hang on a minute, in that 3D thing, that building was 10 stories high. Why is it now only 3? And I thought the front door was over there, not over there.
Yeah.
So, and I've bought across the road. So what's going on with that?
Yeah.
So we've got to go through that yet. It's coming.
Yeah.
We went through it with our hand-drawn perspective sketches years ago. We had to be quite careful with it about the expectations that you put, because there's no hiding in a 3D render. If you haven't resolved stuff,
you see it.
Yeah. So you either have to make it up, and that's never good in our discipline to be making stuff up.
Yep.
But there's a lot of making stuff up going on at the moment.
Yep.
It's different if it's part of the design process, because there's a caveat on it. So I haven't resolved this, I haven't documented it, so it's just really an idea at the moment. I'm testing it out. So that's.
I think it's that second you go into the public realm and start to communicate an idea beyond that team involved.
Yeah.
And then if you're trying to hide stuff, I think that's dangerous. And I feel like a lot of young families who buy into houses based on the render they see on the Facebook ad or a billboard that they're driving past, they fall in love with it, and the end product actually doesn't look like that anymore. And it always ends in disappointment. So I think that's a valid piece of advice for, I think, all the young designers that are listening, to make sure that they're amazing, powerful tools, but use it at the right time.
Use it wisely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. With great power comes great responsibility.
Exactly.
Spider-Man.
Exactly. And there'll be other things in the technology that it advances very quickly in terms of how quick it will be to produce it. The gaming influence on the built form rendering is amazing at the moment, and it can be quite fluid. But we try and explain it. It's a design tool until the point that it's been approved and there's construction and it's been determined that is going to be the outcome, and then it's a marketing output or a sales output, and the two are quite different. We try and make them look different. Like, again, my example of buildings, our buildings in our working tools are deliberately white and stick figures.
Yeah.
Because we really haven't resolved them. We don't know whether they're glass or they're wood, or they've got a pitched roof or a not pitched. That's not our thing, but we know that it's 3 stories and it's got an awning out there, so we'll show that bit, and the rest of it's left blurry.
Yeah.
But that looks terrible in a marketing render.
Of course.
Yeah.
No, I think, look, even personally speaking, I've learned a lot about what urban design has been about today. And one of the last things that I want to ask is, for anyone who's very keen on becoming an urban designer or want to learn more from today, do you have any resources or websites or books or anything like that that someone can go and learn more about that you can recommend?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of background material. America produces a lot through the New Urbanist group there. That's probably more master planning. Architecturally, there's an enormous amount of material that you can have a look at that documents outcomes from an architecture point of view. The UK and Europe are probably better at that side of things. Mm-hmm. I suppose where I come from with it is to say, take a little bit of everything. Don't take a lot of one thing.
Yep.
We certainly see it with people who maybe go down the New Urbanist rabbit hole too quickly, too early, and start espousing things they don't really understand and can't relate the context to Australia. You know, where we're at 15, 20 dwellings per hectare, in America's at 60 dwellings per hectare. There's a lot of subtle differences in terms of what occurs in that. So I think urban design, it's really important to pick from a lot of sources. Don't get stuck in one particular area. You need to keep moving and keep looking at other areas and other resources.
I think that's valuable advice, actually, given back to what you mentioned at the start of today, that urban design being that central, sphere where landscape and architecture and town planning and all those different disciplines come together. So a bit of everything. It's a jack of all trades.
Yeah, exactly. Like landscape architects do really lovely at their drawings. Like their drawing styles and techniques and communication are fantastic. Architecture is really good on the third dimension and how they explain the third dimension. Town planning is really good on the words, and if you care to have a look at some of the things they're writing, there's actually some good stuff in there. Mm-hmm. But it's not as interesting sometimes as looking at a picture.
Yeah.
And then we're trying to combine all of that into pinch from all those disciplines and try and combine it into one area.
Yeah. Peter, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. And I know that the listeners are going to have a ball with this one because there was so much information packed into this little time. And it's been a learning experience for myself as well. So thank you for giving up your time.
No problems, Rashan. Nice to meet you.
Likewise.